Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, January 29th, 2009. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, a handful of German brewing techniques that you can try maybe in your next brew day. Home brewer Kai Troester joins us to share some tips and techniques that he's found from his research into brewing from the German traditions. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter, my username, Basic Brewing, all one word. I'm sending out the 2009 Brewers Logbooks still. The logbooks have a calendar in the front to track your brews and a space to log the details of up to 50 brewing sessions in the back. You can check them out on our online store, basicbrewingshop.com. And thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our Basic Brewing site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us bring you this show. And we appreciate your support. This is the iced-in episode of Basic Brewing Radio. Those of you who follow me on Twitter are probably sick of hearing about it, but we're digging out from the effects of a severe ice storm here in northwest Arkansas. And if you hear a droning noise in the background, that's my neighbor's portable generator. Or you may hear an occasional chainsaw, or you may hear the faucet here in this little studio room slowly dripping to keep it from freezing. Luckily, we do have power after only being out for 5 hours or so yesterday, but a big tree limb fell on our gas meter, so we're relying on borrowed space heaters, electric space heaters, to keep us relatively warm here at the house. One homebrew-related note: since we were without natural gas yesterday, I used my trusty propane burner last night to heat up some soup for supper and to heat the water to wash the dishes. And yes, I did it outside on the patio. Many broken trees all over the area. It looks like a tornado came through. And it was quite eerie last night to hear and see trees cracking and splintering and then shedding ice-coated limbs down to the ground. Luckily, none of them hit our house or cars, but we know friends in the area who weren't so lucky. Lots of damage. So, and I know that it's not just northwest Arkansas, it's throughout the area. So, my thoughts are with you guys. We're all in the same boat. But enough of that. I appreciate all the supportive comments that you guys have sent through Twitter. And sorry if I overloaded you with too many storm tweets during the whole thing. On to more happy things. Lots of movement in the beer-related legislation across the country. Let's start in Utah. Douglas Wrzezinski reports from Salt Lake City that the bill that would legalize home brewing there is moving forward. On Monday, HB 51 was introduced to the House, then promptly referred back to committee. But Douglas says he had to scramble to garner support for a committee hearing the next day. But Douglas says, we had a great turnout. A number of homebrewers took the day off from work to show their support for the bill, namely Dirkus, who wrote into your podcast last week, drove down from Smithfield to show his support, a very long drive. Douglas says, we also had a representative from Crosby and Baker, who they sell homebrew equipment and ingredients, by the way. Mark Alston, the Beer Nuts owner, was there, along with Jamie Burnham and a couple of law students. Representative Johnson commented on how quickly we homebrewers mobilize. Douglas says Mark Alston, speaking before the committee, as he has done at every committee, was very eloquent and did the homebrewing community a great deal of credit. During the meeting, multiple committee members commented on how surprising it was to receive as many emails as they had in support of the bill. So, see there, this stuff works. According to Douglas, the committee forwarded the bill back to the House with a favorable, unanimous recommendation. And by the way, there is a new episode of Douglas's podcast, Homebrewing Perspectives, out there, if you haven't checked that out lately. More good news from Washington State. Mark Emily writes in with this: I'm extremely happy to announce that WAHA testified on the 20th, and the Washington Homemade Beer and Wine Transportation Bill was supported unanimously and moved out of Senate committee. Now, that's the law that would allow you to actually take your homebrew places and serve it to other people other than just like judges in a contest. Mark says, we also received feedback that our approach of flooding the committee members with emails and phone contacts has helped us get an early hearing and quick passage. We will continue the effort by focusing contacts on the subsequent committees and legislators as the effort progresses. The good news is that we are on a strong course thanks to everyone's help. But making a bill into law has a bunch of little hurdles. We will continue to guide people through them and help point you to the next area to focus on. Mark says Washington listeners can now help by contacting the Senate Rules Committee. This is an easy contact. Just call and email their offices and tell them your name, where you're from, that Senate Bill 5060 passed the Labor, Commerce, and Consumer Protection Committee unanimously, and that you want them to move Senate Bill 5060, the Homemade Beer and Wine Transportation Bill, to a vote on the Senate floor. These contacts can literally take less than a minute each. Also, it will be helpful to contact the Lieutenant Governor's office with the same message. Mark says, for the current status of the bill and the legislators that we need to contact, always check the WAHA website at wahomebrewers.org/legal. That's wahomebrewers.org/legal. Meanwhile, Vicki Watson down in Mississippi reports in on the progress of legislation to raise the cap on the beer's alcohol level in that state. Vicki says SB 2017 has been referred to the Finance Committee, where it died last year. However, Vicki is more hopeful this time. Vicki says within the bill, MEBA, the Mississippians for Economic and Beverage Advancement, has inserted the words "and beer" in order to legalize homebrewing in Mississippi. Vicki says our laws already state it is legal to make wine. No one, as far as I know, says Vicki, has opposed adding those words. However, MEBA has said that they will eliminate those words if it will get the alcohol by weight raised. In other words, if the objection to the bill becomes those words, they will drop them. They have also asked that the local homebrew clubs not get involved at this time, so we are in a wait-and-see situation. Vicki says, though we obviously support MEBA's efforts, we are also wanting the homebrewing side to pass as well. We, our homebrewing club, have stepped back until we see what happens. So don't contact your legislator in Mississippi. You can find out more at hbamm.org. That's hbamm.org. We'll be pulling for you guys. Please keep us posted. And thanks again to Douglas, Mark, and Vicki for the information. I hope that we're helping to move these laws forward, because it's just goofy that homebrewing is illegal anywhere. That's a lot of solid information here at the beginning of the show. I feel like I'm back in the newsroom, although there's not smoke everywhere. That tells you how long ago it was when I was in a newsroom. And now let's hurry on to our conversation with Kai Troester on German brewing tips. Well, Kai Troester, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Well, thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, you emailed me and said that you had some information on some German brewing techniques, and I was so impressed with the thin mash technique and the results that Steve and I have gotten using that in just a couple of brews that we've done recently. That I said, hey, come on back and share some more stuff that we can try out as well. And it's interesting that I use Google to search for certain brewing topics and for mentions of the podcast and such. And I've found some blogs and some forums out there that have mentioned that tip from this show and using it in their own brewing. And they're getting similar results, or I'm seeing similar results out there, that using a thinner mash will give you a bit of a boost in efficiency. So thank you for helping us with that. If nothing else, that you can have that in your legacy there, Kai.
Well, I hope so. And I think the thinner mash does generally work better because it's just easier to stir if you ever have to adjust pH and have to stir into gypsum or so into a thick mash. It's just almost impossible to really even it out.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're calling this German brewing techniques. We're going to talk about half a dozen of these techniques. Where did you pick these up? And I guess they are German in origin, right?
Yes, I would say so, that they are all German in origin. And I picked them up just by reading about German brewing in general, looking at German textbooks for brewing, and being on a homebrewers forum for German homebrewers. And just also there I picked up how Germans are doing home brewing and how it is a little bit different than what is generally done in American home brewing. Although a few of these, or actually more than a few of these techniques that I want to talk about, are more advanced techniques. So it's nothing you should really worry about if you're just trying to get your process down. But if you're looking to do something that's a little different, then you may want to give some of them a try.
But as I always say, when people say, people ask me, why is your podcast called Basic Brewing when you do talk about advanced techniques? And I get around it sort of by saying, well, even advanced techniques become basic once you know how to do them. For instance, at one time in my brewing career, all grain brewing was beyond my scope of understanding, but now it's just routine. So I think that if we can talk about these techniques and kind of simplify them, they might be an interesting kind of arrow in the quiver of the homebrewers' arsenal out there. You talked about the German homebrewing techniques. How would you categorize American homebrewing techniques? Do we, in general, follow more English brewing styles as homebrewers here in this country?
Yes, I would think so. And just because the English style of brewing is traditional, the single infusion mash done actually in the same vessel that you would use to mash and to lauter. And that's what most homebrewers use, a cooler and a single infusion mash, and in the same vessel they would also lauter the mash. And because that is so much easier for a homebrewer to do than the German style of mashing, where you generally have different vessels for boiling the decoction, for actually keeping the main mash, and then yet another vessel for lautering, and then another vessel for boiling. So it's just much easier to work with just a single mash lauter tun and a boil kettle, and that's why I think that most of the home brewing, how it is done in America, is derived from the English way of brewing. And as a result of that, because most home brewers, or because most microbrewers started out as home brewers, this practice also made its way into the microbrewing. But if you look at the major breweries, they generally have a more German style of brew house, where they have different vessels for mashing, for lautering, and for boiling.
Now, you've got these tips arranged in sequential order through the brewing process. So let's start off at the beginning. You talk about malt conditioning to preserve the husks during milling. So tell us about that. How would we condition our malt to help preserve those husks?
Yes, I came across that when I was reading through some brewing textbooks and also doing some searching on the internet. And what I found is that they said there that most breweries that use a lauter tun would actually either condition the malt with moisture to preserve the husks, or they would use wet milling. Wet milling means that the malt is actually milled underwater, and it's something that is impractical for the home brewer. But the malt conditioning itself just involves increasing the moisture within the husks, such that during milling the husks become more pliable and they don't fracture as easily. The way it's done is you would just add water to the malt, but only so much water that you slightly increase the moisture content of the husk, but that the grain itself is not wet yet and doesn't really stick together. And then when you mill that malt, the husks will stay together better, but the endosperm will still be cracked, and you're not getting a mess or doughy mess on the rollers. The latter will actually happen if too much water is used for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like to me that if you overdo it, then you're going to gum up the process, literally, by getting the insides of the kernels wet as well. And it seems like to me if you get too much water, then that flour that kind of happens would start to kind of make dough balls as well. How do you moderate? How do you get just the right amount of water in the process?
Well, the way I do it is I just take a spritz bottle and I tip the bucket that the malt is in, and I keep rotating it and spraying into that bucket and trying to evenly coat the husks or the malt with this moisture. And then after a while, I just would get in there with my hands and just mix up the malt and trying to feel the malt, seeing just to see is it already getting to a damp stage. And once it feels damp, and if you squeeze it in your fist and open the fist, and a bunch of those kernels start to stick to your hands, then it's generally good to go. And I would wait a little longer, oftentimes, just to let the water penetrate into the husk a little longer, and then I put it in the mill and start milling that malt.
And this is there any difference in the process of actually milling? Is it do you change the gap at all?
No, there's no difference really in the process. You may feel that it feels that it's harder to mill because the kernels don't easily fracture, I assume. But you can actually tighten the gap a little more because of the better preserved husks. You're less likely to get a stuck sparge, but at some point, as you keep tightening the gap, you may still see that the run-up speed gets slower just because you're producing a lot of flour, and the better preserved husks are not able to compensate that.
So that's the reason why you want to preserve your husk, is you want to have a filtering mechanism in the lautering process.
Right, and it makes more sense, I feel, if you have, for instance, a lot of wheat malt in the grist, because you're brewing wheat beers, because there you just want to have you want to just retain as much of the filtering capacity of the malt, of the barley malt as possible. For example, I don't use rice hulls. I just live with just a slowly, or a slightly slower sparge.
So that sounds like an easy tip. That doesn't sound very advanced at all.
Well, it can be a pain really to do that, and if you do it too much, then you start to gum up your rollers. So that's why I say do that with your own mill. Don't try to do that at a homebrew shop.
Oh. You might need to find a new homebrew shop after that.
Probably, yes. And there's another benefit that I found with that actually. If the husks are better preserved, then the whole grist just looks fluffier. I mean, it has its volume after milling the malt is greater than if you wouldn't condition it. And I feel that actually helps in these thin mashes that I have been advocating. That actually helps to evenly distribute the starch within the mash.
Are you ready to move into the mash tun?
Yes.
Now you talk about the step mashing, and it is a certain kind of step mashing.
Yes, the step mashing that now is used in almost all big breweries in Germany is what's known as the Hochkurz step mash. And what that means, this word Hochkurz means, it refers to the fact that the dough is at a high temperature, that's the Hoch, And it means that the mash itself is fairly short, and it's the quarts. And when I say that the dough-in happens at a high temperature, I mean that it happens above the protein rest range. So generally the dough-in happens between 57 and 63 degrees Celsius, which is between 135 and 145 Fahrenheit. And the short mashing, means that it's between 90 and 120 minutes for the complete mash program.
And what advantage does this give us over a lower and longer mash rest at that temperature?
Well, I believe that the main advantage for that is just the fact that it takes less than 2 hours to actually mash, and that's important for big breweries which want to be able to run 10 to 12 mashes per day. And there's also the why the German brew house has so many vessels. It means that actually that all the steps can be pipelined. So at any given time there would be one batch mashing, the previous batch would be a lautering, and then also another batch would already be boiling.
So we talked about last time that there's an effect if you mash at a higher temperature, that certain enzyme that you're trying to utilize ramps up its efforts because of the higher temperature. Is this sort of the same thing? You're doughing in at a higher temperature, so those enzymes that would be working slower at a lower temperature are ramping up their activity?
Well, no, this dough-in temperature it's above the protein rest because the malt that is used is highly modified and doesn't really need a protein rest anymore. But it's still below what is generally used for a single infusion mash. And that's in the German way of doing the saccharification is generally with two rests. So there's the first rest around between 60 and 63 degrees Celsius, which is between 140 and 145 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's what's called the maltose rest, which primarily relies on the beta amylase to generate fermentable sugars, and that rest is held for 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the limit of attenuation that's desired. And after that, the mash is heated at about 1 degree Celsius per minute to either an intermittent rest at 65 degrees Celsius to get even higher fermentability, but then eventually heated to the second rest, which is between 68 and 72 degrees Celsius, or 158 and 162 Fahrenheit, and that's what's called the dextrinization rest, and it's for finishing the conversion of the mash.
And I guess that if you have a recirculated mash tun, like a RIM system or a HERMS system, that may be an optimum system to use in this kind of strategy, as opposed to those of us who have just insulated coolers as mash tuns and have to add boiling water to raise the temperature up for certain rests.
Yes, it's probably easier with some automated way of heating the mash, but I'm using this mash style quite often because it does provide an elegant opportunity for a double decoction. So you can use a decoction to move between the maltose rest and the dextrinization, and then another decoction to move from the dextrinization to the mash out, which is done between 76 and 78 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. So, or yes, you can add boiling water. It's also a mash that you may want to employ if you undershot your rest temperature. Let's say you were aiming for 455 degrees Celsius in your mash, and you ended up at 145 degrees. You were aiming for 155 Fahrenheit. The former would have been rather hot for a mash. Let's say you end up at 145 degree Fahrenheit, and then, just let this mash go for 30 minutes, and then use a decoction to go all the way up to 160 Fahrenheit. Just make it a two-step saccharification instead of a single step.
So that, and I've done that. It's not necessarily with the decoction, but adding boiling water. And basically saying, I meant to do that. Instead of a single-step infusion mash, I meant to do a two-step. And so I think there are probably a lot of all-grain brewers who can identify with that, at least at some point in their brewing careers, where they, didn't exactly hit the temperatures that they were wanting to hit. So you're basically saying, if you do that, don't panic. You're actually doing a mash schedule that is more along the traditional German lines. Right.
And there's something I want to add to actually the dextrinization rest. There are multiple places in the literature where I have found that it was said that there is a head retention and mouthfeel benefit to actually extending this rest to up to an hour. And the explanation was that there are head retention positive compounds extracted from the malt, but the enzymes that would be converting these are already denatured. So they are not broken down, and thus they will survive into the wort.
So this is the rest that is between 68 and 72 C, or 158 and 162 Fahrenheit.
Yes, I have not done a side-by-side experiment yet to actually confirm that I can detect that.
Do you do a mash out with every beer that you brew?
I generally do. It is not really necessary, but I just feel that it's good practice. There's also a lot of discussion whether or not that's necessary or not, and I don't think it's really necessary, but it doesn't really hurt either.
Now, you talk about two-stage boiling, in which you first have a simmer and then have a rolling boil. Now, everything that I've heard says that you need a good, strong rolling boil for at least 60 minutes and perhaps 90 minutes, especially in an all-grain batch. Not so much in an extract batch. But in an all-grain batch, you need a vigorous rolling boil for at least 60 minutes and probably 90 minutes to get all the jobs that need to be done during the boil.
Well, I found, looking at commercial boiling systems, their main concern is to just get the job done with the least energy needed. And there are actually some very interesting boiling systems out there, and even one of those boiling systems doesn't even boil the wort at all. It just keeps it hot and stirred for 90 minutes, and then after the whirlpool it would vacuum evaporate about 6% of it to get the DMS out. So that's the other extreme to the suggestion that you actually need to have a rolling boil for up to 90 minutes. Now, I gave this a try, and I actually gave this two-stage boil a try, where I did a simmer for the first half hour and a regular strong boil for the last half hour. And the idea was that in the beginning, I don't really need to drive off the DMS yet. What I'm actually just interested in during the 60 minutes that the wort is hot is that I convert the DMS precursor to DMS, which then is evaporated. So if you just simmer it the first half hour, just make sure that there is some movement in the boil pot to actually just keep the hops in suspension, and that you get some isomerization, and then just go for the necessary boil off towards the end of the boil, that should be as good, and it actually was. I did not detect DMS in that beer, even if it was brewed with Pilsner malt. But you still have to make sure that you get to a total boil off of about 8 to 10% to get rid of the DMS. And if you don't use an immersion chiller, but use a counterflow chiller or plate chiller, and your wort is sitting hot without boiling towards the end, then you actually may need to go to a 90-minute boil, because you need to make sure that you convert enough of the DMS precursor that only little DMS is formed while the wort is sitting hot.
It's an interesting
So
point.
the main idea behind that was like, well, is there maybe a way I can save some propane if the propane prices get even higher?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It would save energy, and it would also save volume. I mean, if you're used to cranking a full boil for the whole time period, you're going to lose a lot more water.
Yes, but for a lot of brewer that is actually beneficial, because the more water you lose, the more water you can use for sparging, and generally the better your efficiency will be. But I don't recommend that you should make up for bad efficiency by sparging more, because a beer, especially lighter beers, should not be boiled with more than 10 to 15% evaporation.
So that's another tip that we can try fairly easily. Simmering for the first half of the boil, and then doing a full boil the second half to see what happens.
It might be good to make a real light colored pilsner, where you want to minimize the boil off, but you still have to do, let's say, a 90-minute boil to get rid of enough of the DMS and its precursor. So you can just spend the first half creating DMS, and then spend the remaining 45 minutes creating more, but boiling off all that was created.
So you say there's a way to get away with only using half of the yeast necessary for a batch of beer.
Yes, and I've tried that with a few of my bock beers lately, and the technique is called drauflassen. It's the German word for just, put some more onto it. It's in American brewing, I heard it being called double batch brewing. And it's fairly common in breweries that have a brew house which has less capacity than the actual fermenter capacity. So what they would do, they would brew one batch of beer and put it in the fermenter and pitch it with the appropriate pitching rate for that volume. And overnight it would start from fermenting, and it would come to kreuzen. And then the next day they brew another batch, and they'll just aerate that batch as well. And they just add that to the already fermenting batch in that fermenter.
So it's essentially making a starter out of a batch of beer, and then adding more wort to that.
Now the problem is for homebrewers is that, we are not going to brew half a batch one day and going to brew the other half then the next day. That would kind of be too much work. I guess then it would be easier to just grow more yeast. But what I found, what actually works with lagers, is that I could just rack just half of the volume into the fermenter on one day, pitch it, aerate it and pitch it appropriately for that size, and I would need only half the yeast for that, and then overnight it would come to kreuzen, and then I can just add the remainder of that batch after 24 hours, and I would keep that remainder actually in the boil kettle in the same fridge. So it's kept cold in order to retain any retain growth of any spoilage bacteria, and also put a trash bag over the lid just to make sure that nothing blows into the kettle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you wouldn't want a little bit of blue cheese or something to get in there.
No. But I feel that if your sanitation techniques are up to snuff, especially if you make sure that you cover the boil kettle during chilling, that you should be able to keep that wort without a problem unpitched for 24 hours at 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the fermentation fridge. And that's why I say it's easier for lagers than it's actually for ales. But it's generally more a problem with lagers to have the right amount of yeast.
That's true. You need more yeast with lagers than with ales. But as well, if you have a big conical fermenter, say your wife gets you a big stainless steel conical fermenter for Christmas, and you don't have a brew pot that's big enough to fill it yet, you could do brewing one day and get the fermentation started, and then the next day come back and brew another batch of wort and throw it in there on top of that already fermenting beer, and you would be fine.
And don't worry about aerating the second batch that's added. In commercial brewing, I read it is fully aerated, and they don't report any concerns about oxidation that may be happening because the first batch is already fermenting and there will already be alcohol present. The oxygen that's added with the second batch is immediately consumed by the yeast, which is very active at this point. And the benefit is just the yeast just suddenly sees a bigger volume, but it just keeps going. It's even that the literature actually suggests that the level of esters produced by that technique is less because the yeast can keep longer going in its growth, and as long as the yeast grows, the ester production is reduced.
So there may be another advantage just besides saving money on yeast. There may be an impact on the actual flavor of the beer.
Yes, but I want to be cautious with that statement because general homebrewer knowledge about esters is actually the more the yeast grows, the more esters are produced. And I still have to make side-by-side experiments to see which one is actually the one I can see.
You're a smart man. Always be skeptical about everything we read in this, as we've discovered. Well, excellent. Now, there's also another technique that I'm not even going to make an attempt at pronouncing, but it's racking the beer while it's still fermenting in order to build up carbonation in the keg.
Yes, and that's called Grünschlauchen, and it means green racking of the beer. And that is a technique that is commonly used by German homebrewers, even to bottle beer. And that is may sound as a very scary proposition to actually bottle beer that is still fermenting, because how would you know how long that beer would still have? I mean, how much fermentable sugar is actually left in that beer if you want to bottle it? You wouldn't be able to predict the carbonation that it will produce, or if you get bottle bombs.
Right.
But you can get around that by doing a fast ferment test that I have mentioned in the first show, where you do a quick ferment of a small sample of wort to see where's the limit of attenuation, and then you would know how much sugar is actually left when you bottle, and you could predict the carbonation that's to be expected.
Yeah, this is one technique that I would classify as being advanced, because the repercussions are potentially dangerous.
You don't really want to mess with it, and I don't really advocate it to be used for for bottling. I think the method of completely fermenting out the beer and then adding a controlled amount of priming sugar is better suited for bottle conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
But if you, for instance, plan to lager a beer and want to build up some carbonation in the keg, then you could use that technique. You could rack the beer into that secondary keg when its gravity is about 4 points or 1 degree Plato above what you expect the final gravity to be. At that point, there should still be enough yeast in suspension in the beer that you will be able to finish the carbonation process. I do that actually a lot. I would rack it into a secondary keg and would then perform the diacetyl rest or the maturation of that beer with a closed keg, and it builds up carbonation. And when the beer then has reached the final gravity that I expected it to reach, I would then crash it to lagering temperatures.
Is there what is the advantage to doing this technique?
I think it's faster. You don't have to wait as long to actually rack the beer. You do have to be careful with diacetyl bonds. You want to make sure that once you crash the beer to lagering, that the diacetyl has actually been fully consumed by the yeast. But I feel that if I have carbonated beer in the lagering phase, that it's much easier to take a sample of that beer, and that when I finally rack that beer to a serving keg, then I don't have to carbonate it anymore.
So that's one fewer step that you have to do manually. You just let the yeast do it for you.
Yes.
And then the last tip that we have is, let me see if I can pronounce it myself, spunding?
Spunding.
Spunding.
Or Spundung. That's the German word is Spundung.
I was close. I had the same number of syllables. Now, what are we talking about here?
That's actually something I believe that Chris Colby mentioned on one of your shows a while back, and that's the control of the head pressure in a secondary fermentation or even primary fermentation, to the extent that you control the CO2 content that is in the beer. So for each CO2 content and beer temperature, there is a CO2 head pressure at which there is an equilibrium. So that head pressure, if you can control that, you can control the CO2 content of the beer, and that actually works well with that Grünschlauchen that I mentioned earlier, or the practice of krausening, where you actually add freshly fermenting beer to the racked beer in order to add fresh yeast and fermentable sugars.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, if you actually control the head pressure, then you don't really have to be exact in measuring the amounts of sugar that is left in the beer after you racked it. Just because as long as there is enough sugar in, that beer will fully carbonate. And anything that's in excess of that will be blown off through the Spunding valve, which is a pressure sensitive blow off valve.
So it does require an additional piece of equipment.
It does, but you can also do it with a manual way if you have a bleeder valve that where you just would open the valve as a little bit and bleed some of the pressure once the pressure exceeds what you would set as the maximum.
Mm-hmm. So you need a gauge where you can kind of tell what the pressure is in the keg, and then either do it manually or with the Spunding valve.
Yes.
And what would be the advantage of this as well?
So I always said that I like to have my beers carbonated during lagering. It just keeps the lid sealed, and it makes it so much easier to pull a sample because I don't have to hook up the CO2. And the beer would be ready to drink once it is done lagering.
And if you want to be true to the Reinheitsgebot, right?
Yes, the Reinheitsgebot does not allow for the addition of non-fermentation CO2 to beer. Now, that's not necessarily something that the homebrewer worries about, because CO2 is CO2. And there's actually probably a good chance that then maybe the CO2 you buy comes from fermentation. I'm not sure where that is coming from, but I can easily see that big breweries could sell their fermentation CO2.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons why it is done in commercial breweries, and the other reason is just economics, right? I mean, why buy CO2 if you can just use what is naturally produced?
Well, Kai, I appreciate your time once again, and I hope you have a happy 2009.
And to you too, and to your listeners.
Thanks again to Kai for all the information. I am going to put some of those tips to work in my next brew day. Lots of good stuff. I appreciate all the hard work that Kai has done in the episodes that he's appeared on here on the podcast. Remember, we've got the Brewer's Logbook and our new Basic Winemaking Introduction to Wine Kits DVD out on our online store. And we've also got an episode of the Winemaking Podcast, Basic Winemaking Video out there, where Steve and I are starting to make a sparkling wine out of a Chardonnay kit. So check that out as well. If you have home brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. You can check out our low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD on Basic Brewing Shop. And there are also our original DVDs, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing and Stepping into All Grain. And we've got combo deals on our site, and you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. We've also got the shirts, and we appreciate everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Whitney Designs Mighty Store Christmas Tree Bag and Melissa and Doug Deluxe Wooden Folding Princess Castle. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate your support. And we also have an associate link to the Apple Store and to Audible.com. That's all until next week. Hopefully a warmer week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson down in Austin, Texas. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.